There's nothing stronger than the bond between a soldier and his canine partner, but what happens when time and distance threaten to break it? Some connections are meant to last a lifetime, but can they truly survive years of separation? Let us know in the comments if you believe a dog never forgets, and keep watching to see this unforgettable reunion unfold. Jake Lawson never forgot the way Ranger used to look at him before a mission, steady, alert, waiting for the signal that would send them both into the unknown. It was the same look Jake saw in countless Marines over the years, a quiet understanding that they had each other's backs no matter what. But those days were long gone. The war ended and Jake had left the military behind, or at least that's what he told himself. 15 years later, the battlefield had been replaced with something far less predictable: civilian life. He had bounced between jobs, tried settling down, even worked private security for a few years, but nothing stuck. There was always something missing, a weight on his chest that never went away. People called it PTSD, but Jake knew better. It wasn't the war that haunted him. It was the absence of the one soldier who had never failed him. Ranger. Jake had been told his canine partner was retired honorably, taken in by a handler, and given a peaceful home to live out his years. At the time, Jake had no reason to doubt it. War zones were chaotic and soldiers moved on. But something had never sat right with him. When the war ended, he never got to say goodbye. There was no farewell, no final mission together. One day, Ranger was just gone. He had pushed those thoughts aside for years. But now, sitting at a small diner in the middle of Tennessee, staring at an old military buddy who had just spilled the truth over a plate of eggs and bacon, Jake realized everything he believed was a lie. "They didn't retire him, Jake," his friend Logan said, pushing a napkin around his half-eaten plate. "At least not like they told you. Ranger wasn't placed with a handler. He was dumped into the civilian adoption system." Jake's fingers curled around the edge of his coffee cup, the heat barely registering. "What the hell are you talking about?" Logan sighed, rubbing his face like the words exhausted him. "The military phases out K9S differently now. Some get placed with former handlers, but if there's too much paperwork, too much cost. Sometimes they just send them to shelters, let civilians adopt them like they're some stray mutts." He shook his head. Ranger was one of them. For a moment, Jake couldn't speak. The air in the diner felt too thick, the voices around him muffled. "They erased him." His voice came out quiet, controlled, but his pulse hammered in his ears. Logan exhaled sharply. "I'm sorry, man, I really am." Jake looked away, staring blankly at the counter, his gut twisted with something he hadn't felt in years. Rage, betrayal, and something even worse. Because if Ranger had been dumped into civilian life, it meant he was still out there. Jake left the diner without finishing his coffee. His mind raced as he stepped out into the cool morning air, the weight of Logan's words pressing down on his chest. Ranger wasn't dead. He wasn't retired with some handler, living out his days chasing tennis balls in a backyard. He had been discarded, forgotten by the system Jake had once sworn his life to. 15 years. That's how long it had been since their last mission together, since the last time Ranger had run at his side, fearless in the face of chaos. And now, after all these years, Jake had a chance to find him. But where the hell did he start? He drove back to his small apartment, a barely furnished place outside Nashville that had never really felt like home. He tossed his keys on the counter and went straight for the laptop on his kitchen table. If Ranger had been placed in the civilian adoption system, there had to be a record, some kind of paper trail. Jake's fingers moved fast over the keyboard, searching military adoption programs, old K9 discharge lists, and anything related to retired working dogs. What he found was a mess. Some records were sealed, others led to dead ends, and the ones that did exist were vague, filled with generic language about rehoming and civilian transition. Then, after nearly an hour of frustration, he found something. A single scanned document buried in an old database of decommissioned military K9S. Ranger, Belgian Malinois, last recorded handler, classified, status, adopted. Jake exhaled, his pulse quickening. There it was, proof that Ranger hadn't been put down or lost overseas. He had been given to someone. The problem was the document didn't say who. Jake ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair. He needed more than this. If there was a civilian record, it had to exist somewhere. Shelter records, private adoption logs, something. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was only one person he knew who could navigate the bureaucratic mess of military red tape. He pressed the call button. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Who the hell is this?" Jake smirked. "Still mean as ever, huh, Callahan?" A pause, then a low chuckle. "Lawson? You alive?" "More or less," Jake's tone shifted. "I need a favor." Callahan, a former logistics officer turned private investigator, sighed. "You always do. This one's important." There was a beat of silence before Callahan responded. "All right. Talk to me." Jake took a breath. "I need to find a dog." Jake's truck rumbled down the two-lane highway, the asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. He gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts a tangled mess. Callahan had come through, but the information wasn't what he'd hoped for. Ranger had been processed through a government-contracted shelter in Virginia, one that specialized in rehoming retired military K-9s. But beyond that, the trail had gone cold. The shelter no longer existed, shut down 8 years ago. Whatever records they had, scattered, moved, lost. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay focused. This wasn't over. He had a lead, even if it was a weak one. He knew where Ranger had been, and that was enough to keep pushing forward. A green road sign loomed ahead. Richmond, 24 miles. He hadn't been back to Virginia since his service days. It felt like another lifetime, a past he had buried along with everything else. But this wasn't about him, it was about Ranger. And Jake had never left a mission unfinished. The shelter's old address led him to a vacant lot. Overgrown grass, a rusted chain-link fence, and a faded sign barely legible under years of neglect. Blue Ridge Working Dog Rescue. Jake killed the engine, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. He walked the perimeter, searching for anything. An old record, a name, something that could point him in the right direction. Nothing. He cursed under his breath. Then he noticed a small gas station across the road. A place like this, the locals would remember. A bell jingled as he stepped inside. A bored-looking cashier barely glanced up from behind the counter. Jake approached. "Hey, you been working here long?" The cashier, a skinny kid barely out of his teens, shrugged. "Couple years. Why?" Jake nodded toward the empty lot. "That shelter that used to be there, you remember it?" The kid frowned, finally showing some interest. "Oh, yeah, the dog place? Shut down a while back. My uncle worked there." Jake's pulse kicked up. "Your uncle still around?" "Yeah, he runs a boarding kennel outside town." Jake pulled out his phone. "I need to talk to him." The kid hesitated, eyeing Jake carefully. "You a cop?" Jake smirked. "Something like that." A few minutes later, Jake was back in his truck, a new address punched into his GPS. His lead was weak, but it was something. And he wasn't stopping now. The kennel sat on the edge of town, just past a long stretch of farmland and an old church that had probably been there since the Civil War. It wasn't much, just a fenced-in property with a single-story building, a gravel parking lot, and the distant sound of barking dogs. Jake parked his truck, took a deep breath, and stepped out. He had learned over the years that not all leads led to answers, but this one felt different. It had been too long since he'd had a clear direction, and now, with every step toward the front door, his pulse picked up. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the cool air carrying the distinct scent of dog shampoo and fresh kibble. Behind the counter stood a stocky man with a salt-and-pepper beard, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Jake. "You Lawson?" Jake nodded. "You the uncle?" The man wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the counter. "Name's Bill Hartman. My nephew said you were looking for info on the old Blue Ridge shelter." "That's right." Bill studied him for a moment before sighing. Hell of a place, that shelter. Had good intentions, but it was run like a damn government landfill. Dogs came in, files got lost, nobody really kept track. By the time they shut it down, half the records were missing. Jake clenched his jaw. You remember? You remember a Belgian Malinois. Name was Ranger. Retired military, working dog? Bill rubbed his chin. Well, yeah, I remember a few of them. Damn good dogs, most of them. Smart, real driven. But names? We weren't given those. Just numbers. Last I heard, some got adopted by trainers, others by families. Few went to law enforcement. Jake pulled out his phone and scrawled to the scanned document he found earlier, placing it on the counter. This is the only record I could dig up. Shows Ranger was adopted. No name, no address, nothing else. Bill squinted at the screen. Yeah, I recognize that format. That's how the records looked before the state took over and trashed everything. Hold on. He disappeared into the back, leaving Jake standing there, his heart pounding against his ribs. Minutes later, Bill returned with a battered notebook. He flipped through the pages, scanning his old scribbled notes. Here, he muttered, tapping a line with his finger. I used to write down some of the dogs that stood out. There was a Malinois that came through, hell of a strong one. Wasn't mean, just alert. Like he was waiting for something. If I had to guess, that might have been your Ranger. Jake leaned in. Where'd he go? Bill exhaled. I don't know for sure, but I wrote down the name of the family that took him, family in North Carolina. Jake felt his breath hitch. He finally had a location. Ranger wasn't a ghost anymore. He was real. He was out there. And now Jake was closer than ever. Jake stared at the names scrawled in Bill Hartman's weathered notebook. David and Laura Keaton, Asheville, North Carolina. For the first time in 15 years, Ranger wasn't just a memory. He was real, and he had a home. But just because Jake had a name didn't mean this was going to be easy. He leaned against the counter, his mind racing. You remember anything else about them? What kind of people they were? Bill tapped his fingers against the book, thinking. Not much. I remember Laura came in with a little girl, 5 or 6 maybe. Kid was scared of the big dogs, but this Malinois, Ranger, if that's him, he just sat real still, like he knew she was nervous. Didn't jump, didn't bark, just let her come to him. Jake could picture it in his head. Ranger had always been like that, sharp as a blade in the field, but gentle when it mattered. They seemed like good folks, Bill continued. Not the type to dump a dog when it got inconvenient. If they took him, it's 'cause they wanted him. Jake nodded. That was something, at least. But it didn't make the pit in his stomach any smaller. If Ranger had been with the Keatons for nearly 15 years, what was Jake expecting? That he'd just knock on their door and Ranger would come running like no time had passed? It was a stupid thought, but it was all he had. He shook Bill's hand and thanked him before heading back out to his truck. The afternoon sun had started dipping behind the trees, stretching long shadows across the parking lot. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the Keatons' address scribbled on a scrap of paper. North Carolina, a 6-hour drive. Jake rubbed his face, exhaling hard. This wasn't just a road trip, this was it, the last stretch of the search. He shifted into gear and pulled onto the highway. Miles rolled by, the green road signs ticking down the distance to Asheville. His thoughts drifted back to Ranger, to all the times they'd trusted each other with their lives. How many times had Ranger pulled him out of hell? How many nights had they spent side by side, the only thing between them and danger being their unshakable trust in each other? And now Jake was the one tracking him down. As he crossed into North Carolina, doubt started gnawing at him. What if Ranger didn't recognize him? What if the Keatons turned him away? What if, after all these years, Jake was just another stranger knocking on their door? He gripped the wheel tighter and pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. He wasn't turning back now. The only way to get his answer was to keep driving forward. Jake pulled into the quiet Asheville neighborhood just as the sun dipped below the Blue Ridge Mountains. The houses here weren't flashy, but they had the kind of warmth that told you families had built lives inside them. The Keaton home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a single story with a wide front yard and a wraparound porch. A wind chime dangled near the door, swaying gently with the breeze. He sat in his truck for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He'd kicked down doors in combat zones, walked into war zones without blinking, but now, sitting here staring at a front porch, he felt like his lungs couldn't get enough air. It was the uncertainty that got to him. Jake didn't know what he was walking into. Would Rancher even be here? Would the Keatons welcome his questions? Or would they slam the door in his face? 15 years was a long time. Still, he hadn't come this far to sit in his truck like a coward. He exhaled sharply, grabbed his phone, and stepped out onto the driveway. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way up the front steps. The wood groaned slightly beneath his weight, and for a second he swore he heard movement inside. Quick footsteps, something shifting against the floor. He hesitated, then knocked. A few seconds passed. Then the door creaked open. A woman, likely in her early 50s, stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning him with cautious curiosity. She had light brown hair streaked with gray, and the tired but kind expression of someone who had spent years taking care of others. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jake cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you Laura Keaton?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." His fingers curled slightly at his sides. "My name's Jake Lawson. He swallowed. "I think you adopted a dog a while back. A Belgian Malinois from a military canine program." Her expression didn't shift at first, but something flickered behind her eyes. Jake pushed forward. "I was his handler." Silence. For a moment he thought she was going to shut the door right then and there, but then she stepped back, opening it wider. "Come in," she said quietly. Jake stepped inside. The house smelled of coffee and wood polish, the kind of scent that made a place feel like a home. Photos lined the walls, family portraits, vacations, moments frozen in time. Then his eyes landed on one in particular. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, hugging a Belgian Malinois with graying fur and deep, intelligent eyes. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Ranger. Or rather, Duke." Laura followed his gaze, her voice soft. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Jake sat stiffly on the living room couch, his hands clasped between his knees as he took in the home around him. It was warm, lived in, a place of comfort. But all he could focus on was the framed photograph of Ranger, now Duke, resting on the mantel. The dog in the picture still had the sharpness in his gaze, the same alertness Jake remembered. But there was something else, too. Something softer, a life that had moved on. Laura sat across from him in a worn-out armchair, her hands curled around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. The silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "I had a feeling this day would come," she admitted. "Not exactly like this, but I always knew someone from his past might show up one day." Jake lifted his gaze. "So, you knew?" She nodded. "Not at first. When we got him, he was just Duke to us. He was already trained, already disciplined, and we figured he had come from somewhere important. But then, as the years passed, I started noticing little things. The way he reacted to certain sounds, the way he would sit perfectly still, waiting for a command no one gave. He never really acted like a normal pet." Jake's chest tightened. "Of course, Ranger. Duke hadn't. A war dog never truly stopped being a soldier." Laura sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "It wasn't until a few years ago that I did some digging. I found out about the shelter he came from, and I started putting the pieces together. He wasn't just any dog. He belonged to someone. But by then," she hesitated, "by then, he belonged to us, too." Jake's jaw clenched, but he nodded. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only one that made sense. Laura studied him for a moment, her voice careful. "Why now, Jake? After all these years, what made you start looking?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I thought he was retired the right way. I thought someone had taken him in. Someone from the unit. Someone who understood. I found out a week ago that wasn't true." Laura's eyes softened. "I'm sorry." Jake shook his head. I needed to know. I needed to see." He said. At that, Laura set her mug down and stood up. "Then you should." Jake's heart kicked up. His fingers tightened against his knees. Laura walked to the back door, pushing it open. A burst of cool evening air drifted in. Beyond the porch, a wide backyard stretched into the woods, and in the center of it all, lying beneath an old oak tree, was a dog. His coat was dusted with gray now, but he was still strong, still sharp. Jake's throat went dry. Laura called out softly, "Duke, someone's here to see you." The old dog lifted his head, and for the first time in 15 years, Jake locked eyes with his partner. Time seemed to slow as Jake stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath his weight. His heart pounded hard in his chest, louder than the soft rustling of the leaves around him. In the fading twilight, Ranger Duke watched him closely, ears perked forward, head slightly tilted, as if trying to place the man who now approached him. Jake walked slowly, deliberately, stopping a few yards away. The silence felt heavy, charged with years of unspoken words and unfulfilled goodbyes. Ranger didn't move, didn't wag his tail or bark or show any sign of recognition. He just stared, waiting, as he always had, alert, unwavering. Jake's throat tightened. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move. Jake felt a wave of uncertainty crash over him. Had too much time passed? Was he nothing more than a stranger to the dog who had once been his closest ally? He slowly knelt in the grass, ignoring the dampness seeping into his jeans. His fingers curled loosely at his sides, palms up in a gesture of openness. Ranger's eyes remained fixed on him, still cautious, but curious now, the edge of wariness fading just a bit. Jake took a shaky breath. "I know it's been a long time, Ranger," he began quietly, his voice low and steady. "I never thought I'd lose track of you. I never meant for you to end up here alone, I thought." He swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in his throat. "I thought you were okay, that someone took care of you, but it was my job and I messed up. I should have been there." The old dog's head tilted slightly, ears twitching again. Still no movement, just careful observation. Jake's heart sank, but he kept talking, desperate for some sign of connection. "You saved my life so many times," he continued, his voice raw with guilt. "There were nights I didn't think I'd make it home, nights when it was just you and me against the world, and every time you were there, every damn time." Jake's eyes stung, but he didn't look away. "I don't know if you remember any of that, maybe it's selfish, but I had to find you. I had to know you were okay. That's all I ever wanted." The silence hung between them, thick and unyielding. Jake's shoulders slumped slightly. Perhaps it was foolish to expect more. Perhaps this was enough. Seeing Ranger safe, knowing he had lived a good life with a family who loved him, he slowly rose to his feet, ready to turn away and give Ranger back the peace he deserved. But as he stood, something made him pause. A small shift in Ranger's posture, a flicker in his eyes. The dog lifted himself from the ground, his muscles moving slowly, betraying his age. But his eyes still held the sharpness Jake remembered. Jake held his breath, frozen as Ranger took one cautious step forward, then another, closing the gap between them. The old dog paused just a few feet away, looking up into Jake's eyes as if searching for something. Jake didn't dare move. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ranger's tail gave a single, gentle wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake's chest swelled with relief, with something deeper than words could convey. Slowly he extended his hand, palm up, just as he used to before every mission. Ranger hesitated, sniffed the air once, then stepped closer, pressing his nose gently against Jake's open palm. It was the only answer Jake needed. After 15 long years, Ranger was home, and so, finally, was Jake. Jake didn't move. He barely breathed. His hand remained steady as Ranger. Juke pressed his nose into his palm, inhaling deeply as if pulling something from the past. The touch was brief, but it was real. A lifetime had passed between them, but for a fleeting moment it was as if nothing had changed. Then Ranger stepped back. He studied Jake, his dark brown eyes filled with something unreadable. Was it hesitation, recognition, or just curiosity toward a stranger who had suddenly appeared in his world? Jake wanted to call his name, to command him like he used to, but it felt wrong. This wasn't the battlefield, and Ranger wasn't that soldier anymore. He had a new life now, a family, and calling him by the name they had left behind felt like pulling a ghost from the past. Laura stepped out onto the porch, watching quietly. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to force the moment into something it wasn't. She simply gave them space. Then, to Jake's surprise, Ranger made the decision for him. Slowly, cautiously, the old dog walked forward and sat down directly in front of him, close enough that Jake could see the gray dusting his muzzle, the softened edges of his once powerful frame. Ranger was no longer the fierce young war dog who had charged into danger without hesitation. He was older now, but in his posture and his steady presence, Jake still saw the partner who had once saved his life. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, running his fingers gently along Ranger's head, feeling the warmth of his fur. It was real. He was real. And then Ranger did something that shattered the last bit of doubt in Jake's heart. The old dog leaned forward, pressing his head against Jake's chest, just like he used to after a long mission, as if grounding himself in the presence of the man he once trusted with everything. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, swallowing the lump in his throat. His hands trembled as he scratched behind Ranger's ears, the way he used to in the quiet moments between the chaos. Laura finally spoke, her voice gentle. "He remembers you." Jake exhaled sharply, nodding, unable to speak. Behind them, the screen door creaked, and a young girl, maybe 16, stepped onto the porch. She hesitated, then looked to Laura for permission before making her way toward them. Her gaze flickered between Jake and Ranger, uncertainty clouding her features. "This is my daughter Emma," Laura said softly. "She and Duke, they're pretty inseparable." Jake nodded, forcing himself to push past the overwhelming emotion. He had come here searching for his lost partner, but what he had found was something more complicated. Ranger, Duke, wasn't just a war dog anymore. He was family to these people. Emma hesitated before kneeling beside Ranger, scratching his side the way Jake had moments before. "Is it true?" she asked. "You were his partner?" Jake nodded again, this time with a small, bittersweet smile. "Yeah, a long time ago." Emma bit her lip. "We always wondered about his past. He never really acted like a normal dog. He was always waiting for something." Jake looked at Ranger, who sat between them, eyes flicking between his past and his present. Maybe, Jake realized, he had been waiting for closure. And now, finally, it was here. Jake sat on the porch steps long after the sun had set, staring out at the backyard where Ranger Duke lay comfortably at Emma's feet. The girl absently stroked his fur as she scrolled through her phone, unaware of how much this moment meant to Jake. He had spent years searching, chasing ghosts, believing he had lost the only partner who had ever truly understood him. And now, here Ranger was, alive, safe, loved. Jake wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe he thought he'd walk up to the house, call Ranger's name, and the old dog would immediately bound toward him like they had never been apart. Maybe he thought he'd take him back, reclaim what had once been his. But sitting here now, watching them, he realized how foolish that had been. Ranger had a home. A good home. Laura sat beside him, cradling a cup of tea in her hands. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't even know what I'm thinking." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You didn't come here just to see him, did you?" Jake ran a hand over his face, leaning forward on his knees. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, at first I thought, Maybe I could take him back, that we could pick up where we left off, but that's not how life works. Laura nodded, taking a sip of her tea. No, it's not. They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around them. Then Jake glanced at her. How long do you think he has? Laura sighed. He's slowing down, but he's still got time. He doesn't struggle much, just takes things easier now. He still plays with Emma, still follows her around like a shadow. But I know the day's coming. She hesitated before continuing. And I think he's been waiting for something, or someone. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. You, she said. I think he's been waiting for you. The weight of her words settled deep in Jake's chest. He could take Ranger with him, start fresh. But what would that really be? A selfish attempt to relive something that was gone? Ranger had a family now. He had spent more time with them than he ever had with Jake. He belonged here. But that didn't mean Jake had to walk away entirely. He turned toward Laura, his jaw set with quiet determination. Would it be okay if I came back? Her lips curled into a small smile. I think that'd be good for both of you. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back toward Ranger, who was watching him now, those dark, familiar eyes locked onto his. Jake gave a small nod. I'm not going anywhere, buddy. For the first time since he left the military, since he lost the one piece of himself he thought was gone forever, Jake felt whole again. Not because he had found Ranger, but because he had finally found peace.